This is Cassandra and my video on learning theories. As background, I will be teaching biology. I'm going to begin with behaviorism. This entails the transfer of knowledge directly through teacher instruction. The student is considered a blank slate and they're receptive of any knowledge their instructor presents in the classroom. Modification can be done to encourage student participation and understanding of context via incentives in the form of verbal encouragement or rewards. B.F. Skinner and Pavlov developed these theories using operant conditioning and positive reinforcement to increase learning. Using this theory in my classroom, I would establish specific learning objectives and build a sequence of learning activities from simple to complex in order to build upon the student's confidence. I will design my lectures such that content would be gradually increased in difficulty and questions would be asked after concepts had been presented. Students would be required to use their short-term memory in this situation because we would be asking questions immediately after the content was explained. I would be sure to provide adequate time for the students to respond, and if their answer is incorrect, I would continue probing with questions that might coax out the correct answer. I want to create a positive learning environment where students aren't afraid to be called upon and they're not scared to have an incorrect answer. These questions are important and engaging if the students are retaining information and on track with the class. The next theory is cognitive learning. Cognitivism learning theory uses a different approach to learning, and instead of seeing students as a blank slate, we consider them people with cognitive skills inherent to their person. Cognitive theories vary as students are intelligent beings that need to participate in their learning rather than being passively lectured at. Their comprehension is a consequence of active thinking. The learning process becomes the student's responsibility when we engage in active learning and problem solving. And as the teacher, I would be responsible for making clear learning objectives, but the student has the responsibility of assembling the knowledge. An activity I would utilize would be shown in my Easly presentation, which I had intended to have available as a PowerPoint, but I don't. I will attach it to the post in the discussion board. I had presented two types of cellular respiration, anaerobic and aerobic, and I presented both a visual device for learning and I also presented the actual chemical equation. This way, I presented students with two ways of viewing the reaction, and a student, depending on the way they learn best, might be able to visualize better than they would be able to remember a chemical reaction. Another diagram I would utilize is a compare and contrast chart between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This way we can take knowledge learned in probably the developmental portion of my class where they would have learned and listened to a lecture, and they can compare and contrast two different types of respiration in plants and animals. The last theory we discussed is constructionism, or developmental learning theory. It's an active process in which students construct new ideas or concepts based on their current or past knowledge. This type of learning takes cognitive theory to the next level as it requires the students not only to learn the concept themselves, but to come up with objectives as well. Two different theorists worked on this. We have Piaget, who assumed children develop intellectually at 4 different stages, and their cognitive level determines the standard of teaching. And then on the other hand, we have Vygotsky, and his variation on developmental theory focused not on developmental age or maturity, but on the student's zone of proximal development. He relied upon the student's individual learning capabilities based upon their prior knowledge. In my classroom, I would utilize this theory through the data I had obtained in developmental learning. I already know my students are technically at the correct age for learning their subject, but determining their zone of proximal development would require an assessment of the knowledge already learned and retained by the students. I would use a labeling diagram in which I would present the chemical equations for both cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and I would have the students dissect the pieces of this puzzle and name the parts, name the carbon dioxide, name the oxygen, name the glucose, so that they can take apart the pieces of the puzzle and hopefully see the big picture by dissecting it into little pieces. I think that these theories all build upon each other in the scientific world and would best be used in conjunction. However, I do like the cognitive theory best. I personally always did well with visual learning devices and active learning. I feel like this cognitive theory bridges the gap between novice learning and higher levels of understanding how processes occur in our biological world. I could see myself using this theory very often in the classroom through posters and diagrams. I think that visuals are very key in biology because we're talking about such abstract things. You can't actually, you can see a cell on a microscopic level with a microscope, but I think that having diagrams would make it a lot easier for the children to understand. So that's it. I liked cognitive, and that's my presentation.